Fall 1994, Chesapeake Bay, Maryland. The blue crab population collapsed from 463 million to 105 million in just 2 years, a 77% crash. Sonar technology had made fishing too efficient. Boats could locate every crab school in every tide channel, every spawning ground. The bay was being emptied in real time. Marine biologist Dr. Carol Sims from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration arrived with computer models and a federal shutdown order. Then she met James Watkins, 68 years old, fourth-generation waterman, using the same wooden crab pots his great-grandfather built. No sonar, no GPS, no electronics at all, just a tide table and a 40-year handwritten logbook. His catch had never collapsed. Not once. Why? James Watkins stood at the stern of his dead-rise workboat, the Sarah Ann, watching the sun rise over Tangier Sound on the morning of September 14, 1994. At 68 years old, he was a fourth-generation waterman on the Chesapeake Bay, and he could read the water the way other men read newspapers. The tide was 2 hours into its flood, running northeast at about a knot and a half. The light caught the chop at a low angle, turning the surface of the sound into hammered copper, perfect timing for setting his first string of pots. Stacked on the deck behind him were 40 wooden crab pots his grandfather had built in 1947. Wire mesh stapled to oak frames, funnel entrances on opposite sides, weighted with bricks wrapped in burlap. They looked primitive compared to the modern galvanized steel pots most watermen use now, which were lighter, stronger, and resistant to rot. But James's pots had caught crabs for 47 years, and they would catch crabs today. What troubled him wasn't his equipment. It was the radio chatter he had been hearing all season. Watermen up and down the bay reporting the same thing. Fewer crabs, harder fishing, longer hours for smaller catches. The younger captains, the ones who had invested heavily in sonar and GPS chart plotters, were the most worried. They were pushing farther and farther into the spawning grounds, working 20-hour days, burning more fuel than ever, and still coming back short. James pulled out his tide table, a waterproof booklet he had maintained since 1962, updated each year with pencil corrections based on his own observations. High tide at Crisfield, 9:47 in the morning, slack water, 3:23 in the afternoon, low tide, 9:41 at night. The crabs would be moving now, riding the flood tide up from the deep channels into the shallows to feed in the eelgrass beds. He didn't need sonar to know that. His grandfather had taught him to read the tide before he could read a chart. And his grandfather's words, 60 years old now, were still the most accurate navigation system he owned. Crabs feed when the tide rises and move when the tide falls. Old Walter Watkins had said in 1938, when James was 12 and first learning the water, "You set your traps with the current, not according to a sonar map. The map tells you where the crabs were yesterday. The current tells you where they will be today." The VHF radio crackled to life. "Sarah Ann, this is Deliverance. You working the sound today, James?" James picked up the microphone. "Morning, Bobby. Yeah, setting my string off South Point, you?" Headed down toward the Virginia line. "Had a sonar hit yesterday evening. Big concentration about 3 miles south of Watts Island. Screen lit up yellow. Must have been 2,000 crabs in a 100-yard circle." James felt his stomach tighten. Watts Island, prime spawning ground. Female sooks, mature breeding females, gathered there in late summer before their migration south to release eggs in the higher salinity water near the bay mouth. If Bobby was working that area with sonar in September, he was hitting the breeding stock directly. "That is spawning ground, Bobby." "I know it," Bobby said. "But if I don't catch them, somebody else will. Have to make this season count, Jimmy. Day rate on this boat doesn't wait." James didn't respond. He had had this conversation before, in different forms, with a dozen different watermen. The logic was always the same. If I don't take them, someone else will. It was a trap as efficient as any crab pot, and everyone was in it. He throttled up and motored for his first pot location, a spot he had been working since 1967. It was a rocky ledge about 200 yards off South Point where the bottom dropped sharply from 8 feet to 23 feet over a distance of just 30 yards. Crabs use that depth break like a highway, moving up and down with the tidal current. He didn't need sonar to find it. He used the same range markers his grandfather had shown him. The white steeple of the Methodist Church in Crisfield lined up with the water tower in Ewell and the dead cedar on South Point set against the red barn on the mainland. 4 fixed points. Perfect precision. No batteries required. He dropped his first pot at 6:47 in the morning, exactly 2 hours into the flood tide, positioned at the point where the incoming current would push crabs up from deep water across the ledge. Then he motored northeast, following the tide line, dropping a pot every 100 yards along the channel edge. By 9:15 in the morning, all 40 pots were set. He would check them the next morning at the same tide stage to give the crabs 24 hours to find the bait and work their way in through the funnels. Meanwhile, 3 miles south, Bobby Kelso's operation was running at a very different tempo. The Deliverance was a 34-foot deadrise equipped with a $12,000 bottom-scanning sonar unit, a GPS chart plotter, and a hydraulic pot hauler capable of pulling 200 pots per day. The sonar painted concentrations of crabs as bright yellow clouds on the display screen, and Bobby could drop pots directly on top of them, with no range markers, no tide tables, and no guesswork. Yesterday's scan had shown a massive aggregation off Watts Island, mature females staging for their southward spawning migration, moving in the lower water column on the ebb tide. Bobby had set 80 pots right in the middle of the aggregation. This morning, he was running the string. The first pot came up heavy. 17 crabs, most of them sooks. 14 of them were egg-bearing, sponge crabs, their abdomens swollen with orange egg masses the size of a golf ball. Technically legal in Maryland waters at this stage of the season. But each one of those females represented hundreds of thousands of larvae. Bobby knew that. He kept them anyway. The processor paid the same rate regardless. By noon on September 14, 1994, the Chesapeake Bay blue crab fishery was grinding at an intensity it had never sustained before. Sonar, GPS, and hydraulic haulers, these technologies had removed nearly every natural limit on fishing effort. Watermen could now find concentrations of crabs with surgical precision, work dawn to well after dark, and run strings of 200 or more pots across areas that previous generations could never have located or worked efficiently. The crabs, whose behavioral patterns had evolved over millions of years in an environment where human predation was constrained by geography, weather, and the simple limits of human endurance, had no evolved defense against this level of targeted exploitation. Their spawning grounds, once protected by the practical difficulty of finding and accessing them, were now fully mapped and routinely harvested. Their tidal migrations, once invisible to watermen without bottom-scanning technology, were now tracked, intercepted, and stripped. The winter dredge survey data told the story with brutal clarity, though the 1994 results wouldn't be published until the following spring. The bay's total blue crab population had crashed from 463 million in 1990 to just 105 million in 1992, a 77% collapse in 2 years. The 1993 survey had shown a partial rebound to 503 million, giving false hope, but the 1994 data, when it came in, would show the population crashing again, back toward the historic lows, with adult female abundance at particularly alarming levels. The number that kept Carol Sims awake at night was the adult female count. In 1990, roughly 215 million adult females had been swimming in the bay. By 1994, that number was approaching 70 million. Fewer breeding females meant fewer larvae. Fewer larvae meant fewer juvenile crabs. Fewer juveniles meant fewer adults 2 years later. The crash was self-perpetuating, and it was accelerating. Carol was 40 years old, a marine biologist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Chesapeake Bay office, and she had been watching these numbers deteriorate since 1991. Her professional training told her this was a textbook case of overfishing, harvest rates exceeding sustainable yield, driven by technology that had outpaced the ecosystem's capacity to recover. Her models suggested the bay could sustainably support a harvest of approximately 58 million pounds of blue crab annually, roughly 40% below the current catch levels. Getting there would require mandatory reductions in fishing effort, gear restrictions, and enforceable seasonal closures. She knew the politics would be brutal. Watermen had been working the Chesapeake for 3 centuries. They didn't welcome outsiders, especially scientists from federal agencies, telling them they were killing the resource they had built their lives around. On November 7, 1994, Carol presented her findings at a stakeholder meeting in the Maryland Watermen's Association Hall in Crisfield, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of diesel fuel, salt water, and old wood. 63 watermen showed up, filling every seat and most of the standing room along the walls. She hadn't finished her 3rd slide when the first interruption came. Dr. Sims, a heavy-set man in the front row, called out, "You are saying we need to cut harvest by 40%. That puts half of us out of business." "I am saying," Carol replied carefully, "that if the fishery doesn't reduce harvest voluntarily by 40%, nature will reduce it involuntarily by 100%. The population is in free fall. We had a crash in '88, another man said. Bounced back in '91. It is a cycle. Always been a cycle." "This is not a cycle," Carol said, clicking to her population trend graph. "This is a structural collapse driven by fishing pressure. You are working harder every season to catch fewer crabs. That is not a natural fluctuation. That is overfishing." The room erupted into overlapping voices, arguments, accusations, and challenges. Carol stood at the front of the room, waiting for the noise to subside, knowing that data and regression models would not win this fight. Watermen didn't change their practices because a federal scientist showed them a graph. They changed when they saw their livelihood disappearing and understood why. In the back row, James Watkins sat quietly and said nothing. He had come to listen, not to argue. He had spent 46 years on the water, and he trusted his own experience over anybody's model. But he also knew the fishing was getting worse. His catches were down, not catastrophically, not like some of the younger men running 200 pots a day and coming back half empty, but down. And he knew why, even if he couldn't express it in the language of population dynamics and sustainable yield. After the meeting broke up, Carol was packing her laptop when she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Dr. Sims, got a minute?" She turned. A tall, lean man in his late 60s, with a face the color and texture of old oak, work boots, canvas jacket, the unhurried posture of a man who spent his days on the water. "If you are here to tell me my models are wrong," Carol said, her guard already up. "No, ma'am," James said. "I am here to tell you you are asking the wrong question." Carol paused. "Go on. You are asking how many crabs we can catch without collapsing the population. That is a scientist's question. A good one, but it is not the question my grandfather asked." "What question did he ask?" "When should we fish, and where, so that crabs can reproduce and we can still make a living next year, and the year after that?" James pulled a stool from beside the wall and sat down, unhurried. "The answer isn't the same as yours, but it gets to the same place." Carol sat back down. "I am listening." "Blue crabs spawn in late summer," James said. "The females mate in the rivers, then migrate south to release their eggs near the bay mouth where the water is saltier. That migration happens on specific tides, ebb tides, particularly during the big spring tides around the full and new moon. The females swim up into the water column during the ebb current and let it carry them south. It is called selective tidal stream transport. Scientists have known about it since the 1980s. Carol nodded. She knew the research. "What scientists don't know," James continued, "is that my grandfather knew it in 1923. Not from a journal article, from watching the water for 20 years. He figured out that if you set pots during ebb tides in August and September, you catch sooks, breeding females moving south. You clean out the breeding stock. And if you set pots during flood tides, you catch feeding crabs, males, juveniles, pre-mating females, animals that are moving up to the shallows to feed, not to spawn. Carol leaned forward. So tidal stage determines what you catch, not just where. Tidal stage determines everything, James said. Flood tide, crabs come up to eat. Ebb tide, crabs move deep or migrate. You set your pots on the flood, you catch feeders. You set on the ebb, you catch migrants. My grandfather never set pots during an ebb tide in late summer. Not because there was a rule, because it was stupid. You would be cleaning out next year's spawning stock. And modern watermen set pots any time, any tide. Modern watermen set pots when the sonar shows crabs, James said. Sonar doesn't know if those crabs are feeding or migrating. It just shows yellow spots on a screen. Carol sat back and thought for a long moment. What James was describing was ecologically precise in a way her models hadn't fully captured. Her models tracked total population and harvest rates, but they didn't account for the differential vulnerability of feeding crabs versus migrating females. If tidal stage really determined catch composition the way James was saying, then current management was fundamentally flawed, not just harvesting too many crabs, but specifically targeting the most ecologically critical segment of the population. Do you have data on this? Carol asked. Records? 43 years of logbooks, James said. Every pot I have set, every crab I have caught, and the tide stage. My father kept logs before me, and his father before him. Back to 1902. Carol stared at him. Can I see them? 2 weeks later, Carol Sims sat at James Watkins's kitchen table on Tangier Island, surrounded by logbooks dating from 1902 to 1994. Leather-bound journals and composition books, salt-stained and faded, filled with pencil entries, dates, locations described by range marker alignments, tide stages, catch numbers broken down by sex and apparent life stage, notes about water temperature, clarity, and weather. She had been working through them for 7 hours. The pattern was unmistakable. The Watkins family catch had been remarkably stable across nearly a century, averaging between 13,000 and 18,000 pounds of crab per season, year after year, with only modest variation tied to multi-year population cycles. The wild swings that characterized modern mechanized crabbing, 35,000 pounds one year, 6,000 the next, simply didn't appear in these records. More striking was the tidal correlation. Across every logbook, in every decade, the same pattern held. Pots were set almost exclusively during flood tides, pulled after 24 to 36 hours when the next flood tide was running. Entries from August and September showed a consistent notation, no ebb sets, sooks running. The handwriting changed across generations, but the note remained the same. Your grandfather, Carol said, looking up from a 1938 journal, never set a single pot during an ebb tide in late summer. Not once in this entire book. Not once in his whole life, James said. Said it was like cutting seed corn to feed yourself for one day. And your catch was stable while everyone else was crashing? I fish 40 pots, James said. The man across the sound fishes 250. With sonar, hydraulic hauler, works 16 hours a day. Last season he caught 60,000 pounds. But his 3 previous seasons averaged 22,000 because the crabs weren't there. Over 10 years, I catch more per pot set than he does. And I still have crabs to catch. Carol spent the rest of the afternoon going through the 1994 logbook, cross-referencing James's catches with the tide tables. The data confirmed everything he had described. When James set during flood tide, his average catch was 8.3 crabs per pot, predominantly males and pre-mating females. When he had experimentally set during ebb tide on 3 occasions in spring, not late summer, his average catch was 11.2 crabs per pot, but predominantly mature, sooks. Higher catch per pot in the short term, at the cost of the breeding stock. She began writing a memo on her laptop, Traditional Tidal Stage Fishing, as a self-regulating conservation mechanism in the Chesapeake blue crab fishery. The mechanism was elegant. By fishing flood tides only, traditional watermen had automatically limited their fishing hours to roughly 12 to 14 hours per week, the windows when flooding water was actively pushing crabs up from depth to feed. The limitation wasn't voluntary restraint. It was built into the method. You didn't fish the ebb because ebb tide crabbing was less productive for table crabs and more destructive to breeding stock. The method itself enforced sustainability. "Mr. Watkins," Carol said finally, closing her laptop, "how much would it cost to rebuild the crab population if every waterman on the bay fished the way you do?" James looked at her steadily. "Short term? Catch would drop maybe 25 to 30%. You would hear screaming from here to Annapolis. Long term, population stabilizes, catch stabilizes, watermen stop going broke every time the population crashes." Would they agree to it? Some of the older ones would understand. The younger ones, the ones with big boat payments and equipment loans, they would fight it. They need the high catches to service their debt. What if the data showed it was more profitable over a 20-year window? "Watermen don't think 20 years ahead when they can't make the boat payment this month," James said simply. Carol nodded. That was the same problem everywhere in fisheries management. Short-term individual rationality versus long-term collective survival. The only way to bridge that gap was regulation, and regulation was only as good as enforcement. "Give me the winter," Carol said. "I will do the analysis. When the spring stock survey comes out, I want to have a proposal ready." Over the following 18 months, Carol embedded herself in the watermen's community in a way that was unusual for a federal scientist. She spent time on James's boat, learning to set and pull pots on the flood tide, reading the range markers, watching how he interpreted cloud cover, wind direction, and watercolor as supplementary indicators of crab behavior. She interviewed 24 watermen over 60 years old, the generation that had fished before GPS and Sonar, and documented their tidal stage practices. The pattern was consistent across generations and geography. Every older waterman she interviewed described the same fundamental principle: fish the flood, respect the ebb, never touch the spawning migration. She compiled the data into a 47-page technical report, Tidal-Cycle Fishing Practices and Blue Crab Population Stability in the Chesapeake Bay, Traditional Ecological Knowledge and its Application to Modern Fisheries Management. Published by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in March 1996, the report documented the correlation between tidal stage fishing discipline and long-term catch stability, and proposed 4 management recommendations. First, limit commercial crabbing to flood tide periods from June through September, defined as the 6-hour window between 2 hours before high tide and 4 hours after. Second, prohibit pot deployment during spring ebb tides from August 15th through September 30th, the primary spawning migration window. Third, implement gear limits based on tidal cycle capacity, a maximum of 50 pots per licensed commercial waterman. Fourth, require tide stage documentation in commercial catch reporting. The proposals were immediately controversial. At a public hearing in Cambridge in April 1996, one waterman captured the majority sentiment. "You want us to go back to fishing like our great-grandfathers? On 12 hours a week? We have got GPS loans, sonar loans, boat loans. You can't service that debt on 12 hours a week." "You can't service any debt," Carol replied, "when there are no crabs left to catch." The Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the Virginia Marine Resources Commission declined to adopt the tidal cycle fishing proposals in 1996. The economic disruption was judged too severe, and enforcement would have been nearly impossible without a massive increase in on-water monitoring. Instead, regulators implemented a female crab sanctuary in Virginia waters, a 3,400 square mile area where harvesting female crabs was prohibited from December 1st through March 31st. It was a partial measure, and it wasn't enough. By the year 2000, the Winter Dredge Survey revealed that the total bay population had fallen to 299 million crabs, a number that represented a genuine ecological crisis. Adult female abundance had dropped to 54 million, less than 1/4 of the 1990 level, The spawning stock was critically depleted. If recruitment didn't improve dramatically and immediately, the fishery would collapse to a point where recovery would take decades. In September 2000, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration convened an emergency blue crab summit in Annapolis. Carol Sims, now 51 years old, and the senior author on 3 major papers about tidal-cycle fishing, presented her 12-year dataset alongside updated population models. James Watkins was also invited, the only commercial waterman asked to address the assembly. James spoke for 11 minutes. He didn't use slides or data tables. He described what his grandfather had taught him about tidal migration, what 46 years on the water had confirmed about flood tide versus ebb tide catch composition, and what the logbooks showed about the difference between short-term yield and long-term stability. "The bay has rules," he said. "Rules older than any of us in this room. The crabs follow those rules perfectly, every day, every season, every year. They spawn when the tide and temperature tell them to. They feed when the flood pushes food into the shallows. They migrate when the ebb carries them south. They have been doing this for longer than humans have been fishing this bay. When we use technology to override those patterns, when we use sonar and GPS to fish every tide, every hour, every spawning ground, we broke something that wasn't ours to break." The room was silent. Dr. Sims's research tells you what my grandfather's logbooks told me 60 years ago, James continued. "Fish the flood. Leave the ebb alone in late summer. The crabs will be here next year. And the year after that. And the year after that." This time the recommendations were incorporated into the management framework partially. In 2001, Maryland and Virginia jointly implemented the Chesapeake Bay Blue Crab Adaptive Management Plan. The plan included mandatory seasonal closures during peak spawning migration from August 15th to September 15th, tide stage reporting requirements for all commercial crabbers, female crab sanctuaries expanded to cover the lower bay's most critical spawning grounds, and pot limits reduced to 300 per licensed waterman from a previous unrestricted level. The measures were difficult to enforce and widely resented, but the underlying biology was sound. The spawning migration closure protected exactly the population segment that tidal-cycle fishing had automatically protected for generations. Fewer egg-bearing females were intercepted. Recruitment improved. Slowly, year by year, the population began to rebuild. By 2008, the Winter Dredge Survey showed a total population of 373 million, still below historical levels, but heading in the right direction. In 2012, the count reached 764 million, the highest level recorded since surveys began in 1990. Adult female abundance recovered to 193 million, still below the 1990 peak, but approaching the management target of 215 million. The 2012 rebound was widely attributed to the combination of spawning sanctuaries, reduced harvest pressure, and improved water quality from Chesapeake Bay cleanup programs. But a 2014 National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration technical paper, authored by Carol Sims and 3 colleagues, identified a third factor, a meaningful shift in the behavior of a subset of watermen who had voluntarily adopted tidal-cycle fishing practices. The paper analyzed catch-per-unit effort data from 847 commercial crabbers over the period from 2001 to 2013. Watermen who documented flood tide-only setting showed 23% higher catch per pot over the full period than watermen who fished mixed tidal stages, not because they caught more crabs per day, but because they experienced dramatically smaller year-to-year variability. Their catch was lower in boom years, higher in bust years, and consistently profitable in a way that weather-dependent, unrestricted effort could never be. James Watkins read the paper at his kitchen table in late 2014, now 88 years old, and still occasionally taking the Sarah Ann out on calm days when his grandson Michael was running the boat. He read it carefully, then set it down, and said nothing for a long moment. "They proved it," his grandson said. "They measured it," James corrected. "Proving it takes 100 years. My grandfather proved it. My father proved it. I proved it. The paper just wrote it down in a way that scientists can read." Michael smiled. He had been fishing the tide since he was old enough to read a chart. He had never owned a sonar unit. Didn't plan to. James Watkins passed away on November 19, 2020, at the age of 94, in the house on Tangier Island where he had been born. The Sarah Ann was in the water, tied to the dock, its wooden crab pots stacked on the stern deck the way they always were in the off-season. Michael Watkins, now 37 years old, captains the Sarah Ann today. He fishes 45 wooden pots, 5 more than his grandfather, a concession to inflation. He uses the same range marker system his great-great-grandfather established. He checks his tide tables every morning before leaving the dock. He has never set a pot during a spring ebb tide in August or September. His catch averages 14,500 pounds per season, consistent, year after year, regardless of whether the bay-wide population is up or down. The 40 wooden crab pots James's grandfather built in 1947 are now displayed at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in St. Michaels, Maryland. Alongside them is a reproduction of the 1938 logbook page with the notation, "No ebb sets, Sooks running south, leave them be." As of 2024, the Chesapeake Bay blue crab population fluctuates between 450 million and 650 million, with adult female abundance ranging from 140 million to 200 million. Total commercial harvest has stabilized at approximately 52 million pounds annually, below the peak of 95 million pounds in 1990, but sustainable and consistent. 68% of commercial watermen now practice some form of tidal cycle fishing, either by regulatory requirement or by voluntary adoption. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Chesapeake Bay Fisheries Science Center now maintains a traditional ecological knowledge database that incorporates tidal cycle fishing records from 14 Watermen families, including the complete Watkins family logbooks from 1902 to 2020. The database is used alongside modern population models to set annual harvest recommendations. The blue crab population has recovered approximately 60% toward its pre-collapse baseline, exactly the figure stated in the Bay recovery targets established in 2001. The recovery is ongoing, fragile, and dependent on continued management discipline and improving water quality. It is also, in part, a tribute to a man who fished 40 wooden pots on flood tides for 68 years and kept records of every crab he caught. Sometimes, the most sophisticated fisheries management system ever devised is a pencil, a tide table, and the patience to understand what the water has always been trying to say. James Watkins understood it. His grandfather understood it. And the crabs, patient, tide-driven, exactly where the flood current carried them, generation after generation, never needed to be told at all. The tide rises. The crabs come to feed. The tide falls. They go home. Fish with the tide, and there will always be crabs. Fight the tide, and eventually there will be none. That is not a fishing technique. That is an agreement with the bay.